Welcome to the New Books Network.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Recall This Book. I am Elizabeth Ferry. Hello. And I'm here with my most distinguished colleague, John Plotz from the English department. Hello, John.
I'm also your least distinguished colleague, but okay. Hello.
And we're delighted to welcome our friend and colleague, Sassan Tabatabai. Sassan is master lecturer in world languages and literatures and the core curriculum. He's a poet, a translator, an editor, and a scholar of medieval Persian literature. And he's also, as I discovered in doing a little bit of online research, a pugilist. So maybe you'll tell us a little bit about that. His work has appeared in Essays in Criticism, the Christian Science Monitor, Literary Imagination, the Seneca Review, Leviathan Quarterly, and the Harvard Review. He's the author of Father of Persian Verse, Rudaki and His Poetry. Apologies if I mispronounce that. 2 books of poems, Uzun Burun poems, and Sufi haikus. And as I hope we'll have time to discuss at the end of the episode, he's also working on a translation of the book Bewilderment by poet and father dear to my heart, David Ferry. Sassan, hello. Welcome to Recall This Book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So we thought in the spirit of other episodes, we'd start by maybe having you read a poem. And I picked one which listeners will know is motivated by my interests in rocks and stones, which is called Firestones. And so we'd maybe kick it off with that. And I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit about the poem before you read it or however.
Certainly. The one thing, the Cardiff in this poem is in England. It's Southern California.
Okay.
It's where I grew up to a large extent. And yes, it's an experience of walking on the beach, and at the end of it, it's basically a love poem, like most other poems.
Awesome.
So there's Firestones. I was collecting rocks on the Cardiff coast, a testimony to centuries of silt left on the shore, of sediment pressed into stone, sandstone, shale, tufa, travertine, jasper, flint. There was a stone that knew the sadness of the sea, that saved its secrets. It was pock-marked with holes and lay half buried in sand, eager to save the ocean's spray, like tears in its miniature pools. There was a stone that always rolled in place. It had rolled round and smooth with each wave, desperately trying to control the tide. There was a stone that showed rings upon rings placed by the sea over the years, that kept time for the Pacific. There were stones that breathed sulfur, that sparked when they touched. Unremarkable in luster or shine, they were the lovers of the ocean, firestones, whose sparks were not dampened by salty waves, but they only made sense in pairs. And there was this one, more white, more brilliant, more polished than any stone. But it was once upon a shell. It needed centuries to become stone. It was a counterfeit firestone. It did not breathe sulfur. It could not make sparks. I traced my steps back along the Cardiff coast, and the stones I returned to the sands. The ocean's secrets would be well kept by the stones. Its tears would be stored in pools, its tides kept in check, its years measured in rings. But love itself I could not leave on the beach. I kept the firestones.
That's wonderful. And hopefully we can get a photograph of these firestones because you say that you still have them. So
yeah.
We'll put it on the...
So something, just a note about the stones themselves. So there's, this is something that I think we learned as Boy Scouts when I was a kid, how to make fire with stones. And if you find the flint stones and you hit them against each other, they make a spark if it's dark enough to see.
Yeah.
And they also smell like sulfur. Mm-hmm. And then when you're looking for these stones, you can always find something that looks like a really beautiful polished white stone. Mm-hmm. But then when you pick it up, you realize that's not even a stone. That's still a shell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's kind of...
Yes.
poems.
Yeah, I love the stuff around time. Both one of the things that feels very compelling about stones is that they are so meaningless or kind of outside of our capacity to engage in meaning, right? So to say that they only make sense in pairs because they are used by humans, right, to do a certain thing. So
Well, if you think about it another way, they actually have a lot of meaning, right? Stones are basically, they've been there forever,
right.
They will be there forever. I think, long after the human being has destroyed the planet and left.
Yeah.
So in a sense, and it's also the sense of, the weight they carry.
Right.
Right? The impenetrability of the stone. For me, there is something so solid and, in a way, comforting when it comes to stones.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe, that's probably a better way to say it is it's kind of like the difference between meaning that at a human scale and then this kind of meaning that's way beyond human scale, right? I mean, keeping time is a form of meaning too, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, there is that tradition of the scholar's rock, the Chinese tradition of picking out, that you pick out a rock that is just, it's almost like a Rorschach blot, like it's just immensely crenellated and filled with holes, and then scholars can sit and contemplate it, and then you kind of, I think that's the kind of meaning you're talking about, where it's ascriptive.
Well, it's sort of both. I mean, I think stones, this is just my own riffing, but stones are compelling because they do both at the same time. They both look like a mountain, right? And some of those scholar stones, or the other line I really like in the poem that I wanted to ask you was this list of different words for stones, tufa, flint, and the kind of almost rolling them around in your mouth, right?
Yeah.
But those are also stones that are kind of in a human scale, right? The stone doesn't have any sense of its own name, of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
Those stones, I'll tell you, I was so, I got so carried away with finding stones on the beach. So I remember that summer in San Diego, I ended up finding and I think it was a National Geographic book of different stones.
Right. Like a field guide.
Like a field guide, exactly.
Yeah.
And I was looking at the stones I had, and I tried to match them up with the images, and then the names just kind of they developed by themselves, and then the sounds of the names, was really what caught my attention.
Right.
So did you keep lists of names? I think that's something Jared Manley Hopkins used to do. He used to just have variant names of things in kind of journals full of names.
Journals full of names.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Especially with the stones.
Yeah.
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 Well, and it's almost like they're clicking against each other in this kind of stone-like way.
That's
You
right,
can imagine them. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
So, great. So maybe I'll shift our conversation a little bit into thinking about your work more broadly. One of the things that's very exciting about it, and I'd love to hear you talk more, is about the ways that you move between being a literary scholar, a translator, and a poet, and in the books that you kindly sent to us, so we could get to know your work better. You move very seamlessly, kind of between these. So can you just sort of tell us a little bit about your practice and how you got there, and what you think about these different ways of working?
Certainly. I started translating with the poet Rudaki, who's a 10th century poet. He is the first major poet to write in New Persian, which dates back to around the 900s. And that was part of my PhD dissertation. So I was doing an interdisciplinary PhD. It was at a program back in Boston University, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, which I guess makes it a collector's item. It was called the University Professors Program.
Oh, yeah.
And I was
Christopher Ricks'
with
program?
Christopher Ricks, exactly.
Right.
I was working with, I worked with Christopher. I still work with him a lot. Worked with Rosanna Warren. And so I was doing something on national identity, in particular looking at Central Asia, the old parts, the old eastern parts of the Persian Empire. As in particular, when the vernacular starts to become used, which is, it kind of fit in all the different national identity theories. And then talking with my advisor about this, the anthropologist Charles Lindholm.
Oh, yeah.
He suggested, as we were talking during our regular meetings, if there was a poet I could translate, because he knew I liked to write poetry, that would fit into the theories. And it was a light bulb moment. I said, of course, Rudaki fits perfectly. So that's how I started with the translating.
So the theory being that the development of a vernacular goes along with or helps to make a sense of national identity?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So after I started translating Rudaki a bit, I'd always been writing poems. So that's really when the translating started. And then from there, I started translating different poets, some 20th century poets, and also back in the classical works. I was teaching some classes, and this is years later when I'm teaching, teach a class on Rumi and Persian Sufi poetry. So I started translating some Rumi, and yes, before you know it, it was the translations, and then everything started to circle back, and then all those translations started to have a real impact on my own poetry. And which kind of led to the Sufi haiku.
Right. Yeah, I think that was a great concept, the Sufi haiku, right? So,
as far as my approach to literature and translating and poetry, it is quite messy. And I might be working on so many things at the same time, and you just roll up your sleeves and kind of take things from here and there and see how it goes.
Is all your poetry written in English originally, or?
Well, I think I published only one poem in Persian throughout all these years. So it's interesting because Persian is my mother language, but English is my first language. So I feel much more comfortable with English. So I translate out of Persian. So my family left Iran when I was in the 7th grade. Right when the Islamic Revolution was happening. So my formal education in Persian pretty much ended in the 7th grade.
Did you speak Persian in the home?
Yes, we still do. I still do with my parents. So the spoken thing is very different than an actual formal education. But then when I started my PhD and started to read Rudaki, a lot of my formal Persian I ended up learning from this 10th century poet.
Interesting.
And so I wrote one poem in Persian. And then, so again, talking about how, little circuitous routes to things, I started translating David Ferry, your dad's poetry. And that has been eye-opening because I always went in the other direction. I always went from Persian to English. Never from English to Persian. And it's been a wonderful experience.
How does it feel very different, and how? Just
in a way, it feels very different, but in another way, it doesn't at all. Because you're still translating, and you're translating poetry. So there's so much more than just conveying the words.
Of course.
It's the music of the poetry. It's the rhythms. It's each poem has a particular breathing rhythm. Right. If you can breathe the poem in a different language, then that kind of becomes a successful poem.
Right. I have another question around translating and kind of immersing in these literary traditions. So along with that comes, along with any poetic tradition comes a lot of convention, right? Musical conventions, metric ones, different kinds of registers of vocabulary. how do you see that influencing your own writing, and can you give any examples or instances where you?
Certainly. There's a few poetic forms in Persian that you read them all the time. It's you hear them all the time. And it's the kind of things that, I don't know, my grandfather might have known them by heart and he would just recite them. My mother might have known them by heart and recite them. And those, it's strange because they kind of infiltrate you. They get under your skin.
Right.
So one particular form that I've started writing in English is the ghazal form.
Right.
And it's a very strict form. Translating a ghazal into a ghazal form in English is very difficult.
Yes.
But then I've started writing them in English. So it's the couplets, the first lines of the first couplet. There's a rhyme followed by a refrain, and then that rhyme and refrain continues in the second line of every couplet to the end.
Right. Yeah.
And
a little bit like a villanelle almost, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a short one.
Please, yeah.
And it's called simply Ghazal. And the themes are, again, it's the kind of mystical themes that have really, grown on me after teaching the mystical Sufi poetry. So this is Ghazal. As a boy, I waited for the smile to appear in you, listened for echoes of the sigh I could hear in you. You are the mirror where I have sought the beloved, her hyacinth curls, a nod, a wink, a tear in you. In the marketplace, you can learn your future for a price. They are merchants of fate. I see the seer in you. What had been buried under the scripture's weight, its truth, without words or incense, becomes clear in you. They who bind you on the altar of sacrifice hide behind masks. Don't let them smell the fear in you. As I approach the house lit by dawn's blue light, step by step, I lose myself. I disappear in you.
I love internal rhymes like that.
Yeah.
There's something very satisfying about them.
It's the thought about the ghazal in Persian, the convention is that they've usually been compared to a necklace of pearls. So each couplet is a pearl, but if that necklace breaks and the pearls fall on the ground, you can put them back in any order, and the poem should still make sense.
Wow.
Oh, neat.
Is it an old form in English as well, or is it only recently that people have started to write ghazals in English?
As far as I know, it's a more recent thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. My son had to write one, and
I'm just fascinated by those forms that get shared across languages. You know,
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, that actually I was thinking about the haiku because the haiku is, I've had conversations with other poets around, for instance, that iambic pentameter is especially good for English, right? The way English is structured works really well in it, and it kind of allows it to have that sort of tension between that kind of delightful tension between something that is metrically constrained and something that is imaginative and kind of feels like a free expression.
And you mean because iambic is a speech rhythm in English?
Yeah. That's the argument anyways.
Yeah.
You guys are both more literary scholars than me, but
I don't know anyone who talks in dactyls, that's for sure.
Right, exactly. Although you're a little bit talking in dactyls when you say that sentence, but and then people say the same for Japanese, for haiku, that it feels very artful in English to write a haiku, but maybe not exactly in the same way in Japanese because it sort of flows a bit more or something. What made you choose the haiku as the form, and why for this particular? What's the conversation between a Sufi tradition and haiku?
With the Sufi poetry, one of the places where it originates is the rubai form. Made famous by Omar Khayyam's rubaiyat.
Sure.
Rubaiyat is just the plural of rubai.
Right.
It's a quatrain. And that very terse meditation, usually on themes of love and mysticism, and they just really go hand in hand. I was very attracted to that. And then I was part of a haiku circle at some point at BU where, everyone is sit around writing haikus and I started, and I think I had just come from the Sufi poetry class. And it just struck me that the haiku is even more terse than the rubai. Right? So it's, wait a minute, that's really lends itself wonderfully to express the kind of mystical themes that we encounter in the Sufi poetry. Right? So
why is brevity wonderful for Sufi themes?
Well, the reason the Sufi poets, they're all mystics when they turn to poetry, is because they're trying to express some kind of mystical experience which by nature is inexpressible. So they turn to poetry. And when little glimpses of the kind of experience that the mystic is going through, I think it becomes little windows into into the way they are, what they are experiencing, which makes the poet make sense. The poem makes sense.
And is it also maybe the sort of mysticism in the observational? Because haikus also, have this kind of impulse to the almost imagistic, right? Like this sort of very specifically observational.
And also, it's something that you can not only just recite in just splits, within a few seconds, but it's the kind of thing that if it's very easy to memorize,
right?
But once you memorize it and you repeat it, then that really again ties into the mystical experience, right? So there's that sense of repetition on particular words that sometimes create that trigger the mystical experience.
Can I ask if music fits into that at all? Like, do you think of it as a musical form or
the haiku?
Yeah.
A little bit. I mean, I would like to think my haiku has music to it. I would like to think all my poetry has music to it. But music is huge with the mystics.
Yeah.
Right? Again, talking about the inexpressibility of the mystical experience.
Right.
Very often they turn to music.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of thing that comes up in discussions in the class all the time.
Yeah.
It's like if you are in conversation with the divine, right? So the thing that comes up all the time is like, what language did God speak to Adam and Eve?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And its chances are, it's not going to be Portuguese, right? So it's the language of the mystic in a way becomes music.
Yeah. I like the image of the window, too, because they are sort of slightly square, too, right? So it does kind of, there's a sort of visual feeling about a haiku as well. Yeah.
And it's, it's interesting to be able to express something within the context of the rigidity of the form.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's just so regularized.
Yeah.
And it's it's.
So I have this is like it's going to come out as a muddled question, but you see if it makes sense to you. There's a tradition in English, like when you were talking about your Firestone poem and the way it becomes a love poem because you think about the two stones representing, two souls and love. That makes me think of an English language tradition in which poetry is so much about the lyrical eye, like subjectivity. But when you're describing the haiku, even with the window, there's that sense of, there's an impersonal quality to the mystical vision. So how do you square those two? Do you think those two things coexist within poetry, or you're sort of always tacking between the eye and the impersonal?
It's the eye in all the Sufi poetry. Right, even my haikus. It's interesting thing because it's all about the you
Mm-hmm.
and not about the I. Right? So, and the you can be understood in different ways. You know, the you represents the beloved. The you can be the divine. It can be, a person you love. But the ultimate goal is that union of the I with the you.
Right.
And it is that union in which the I completely disappears. So it's, in a way, it's looking at two different sides of the coin. Right? The whole point is for that you, for the I to disappear. Right? There's a little Rumi anecdote where the lover goes and knocks at the door of the beloved. And she answers the door and she says, "Who is it?" And he says, "It's me." And she says, no, you don't understand. Go away." So he goes away, and then the poem tells us that he cooks in the flames of separation, right? So he had come to the door with a raw heart, but his heart cooks in the flames of separation. And he wanders for years, and he goes back to the door of the beloved, and he knocks again. And she says, "Who is it?" And he says, "It's you." And she says, "All right, now you understand."
Wow.
Wow.
The ultimate knock-knock joke.
It's the ultimate knock-knock joke.
Well, finally, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about a project that I know about through my father, of translating his work, and you mentioned that as your kind of first experience of translating into Persian, right? And all these ideas around both the relationship between a rigid or constrained form and expression, and the music of lines, and also sometimes with my father's poetry, I talk about poetic salvage, right? Because there's always like a bunch of different lines from different things that are almost like a conglomerate rock, right? Where it's kind of sort of embedded within it.
New England pudding stone.
New England pudding stone, exactly. So we thought I'd love to hear about that project, and then if we could perhaps end our conversation with hearing your reading in Persian of a poem that we've discussed on this podcast before, along with the poet Roger Reeves, Resemblance.
That's right. With David Ferry, I've known him for a number of years. He's in the core curriculum at BU. We taught his translation of Gilgamesh.
Right.
So, and he was always part of the reading. So after a while, we became close. I dare say we became friends.
Yes.
And there was a time
Certainly
we would
true.
meet at Matt Murphy's for lunch on a regular basis. And we would talk about things. And on one of the lunches, I tried translating one of David's poems from Bewilderment, a short one. I think it was Soul. That's the one I started with. Lovely poem. And shortly after that is when the pandemic happened. And then after the pandemic happened, obviously we weren't meeting for lunch anymore.
And Matt Murphy's went out of business. Yeah.
So I started translating the poems and calling David. So it was, in a way, it started as a way for us to have conversations on the phone, without just rehashing small talk over and over again.
Right.
So I would translate one in Persian and I would call him, and he would read the English, and then I would read my Persian. And David doesn't understand Persian, but he has such an incredible ear that he would ask me all kinds of questions, and tell me, "Oh, this works particularly well." And really just going on the rhythms of things themselves. This is resemblance, and resemblance in Persian is shebahat. It was my father in that restaurant on Central Avenue in Orange, New Jersey, where I stopped for lunch and a drink after coming away from visiting, after many years had passed, the place to which had brought my father's ashes and the ashes of my mother, and where my father's grandparents, parents, brothers had been buried. and others of the family all together. خود پدرم بود در آن رستوران روی خیابان سنترال در شهر اورنج، نیوجرسی که برای ناهار و کمی مشروب به آنجا رفته بودم. بعد از دیدن همان جایی که سالهای پیش خاکستر پدرم را به آنجا بردم و خاکستر مادرم، همانجا که مادر و پدر بزرگ پدرم، مادر و پدرش، برادرانش و کسان دیگر خانواده همه با هم خاک شده بودند. The atmosphere was smoky, and there was a vague, struggling transaction going on between the bright daylight of the busy street outside and the somewhat dirty light of the unwashed ceiling globes of the restaurant I was in. He was having lunch. I couldn't see what he was having, but he seemed to be eating, maybe without noticing whatever it was he may have been eating. He seemed to be listening to a conversation with 2 or 3 others, shades of the dead come back from where they went to when they went away. Or maybe those others weren't speaking at all. Maybe it was a dumb show put on for my benefit. هوای اتاق دودی بود و کشاکش مبهمی در داد و ستد بین نور درخشان روز در خیابان شلوغ بیرون و نور همچون چرکین حباب‌های نشسته سقف رستورانی که در آن بودم روی میداد. داشت نهار می‌خورد. نمی‌توانستم ببینم چه می‌خورد، اما به نظر می‌آمد که می‌خورد. شاید بدون اینکه متوجه باشد که چه داشت می‌خورد. به نظر می‌آمد که به گفتگوی 2 یا 3 نفر دیگر گوش می‌کرد. آیا سایه‌های مردگانی بودند که از جایی که رفتند، وقتی که رفتند، برگشته بودند؟ یا شاید آن دیگران اصلاً صحبت نمی‌کردند؟ شاید یک پانتومیم بود که برای من اجرا می‌کردند. It was the eerie persistence of his not seeming to recognize that I was there, watching him from my table across the room. It was also the sense of his being included in the conversation around him, and yet not, though this in life had been familiar to me. No great change from what had been there before, even in my sense that I, across the room, was excluded, which went along with my sense of him when he was alive. That often he didn't feel included in the scenes and talk around him, and his isolation itself excluded others. به نظر می آمد که با یک پافشاری وهم‌آوری ظاهراً متوجه حضور من نیست. من که از سر میز در آن طرف اتاق او را نگاه می کردم و همچنین احساسی که او جزو گفتگوی اطرافیانش بود و در این حال نبود. گرچه در زندگی این برای من آشنایی داشت و فرق زیادی با آنچه قبلا آنجا بود نداشت. حتی در احساسی که من در آن طرف اتاق جدا مانده بودم، چیزی که با احساسات من راجع به او وقتی که زنده بود مطابقت می‌کرد. بیشتر اوقات فکر می‌کرد که جزو مجلس و گفتگوی اطرافیانش نیست و این کنارگیری خودش بود که دیگران را محروم می‌کرد. Where were we in that restaurant that day? Had I gone down into the world of the dead? Were those other people really shades of the dead? We expect that. If they come back, they would come back to impart some knowledge of what it was they had learned. Or if it was indeed down there, then they, down there, would reveal to us who visit them, in a purified language, some truth that in our condition of being alive, we are unable to know. آن روز در آن رستوران ما کجا بودیم؟ آیا من به دنیای مردگان فرو رفته بودم؟ آیا آن کسان دیگر به راستی سایه مردگان بودند؟ ما منتظر چنین چیزی هستیم که اگر بازگردند، باز می‌گردند و دانشی که از آنجا یاد گرفتند را برای ما بیان می‌کنند. و اگر اینجا واقعا آن پایین باشد، آنها در آن پایین برای ما که به دیدار آنها می رویم با یک زبان پالوده حقیقتی را آشکار می کنند که ما که هنوز زنده ایم نمیتوانیم آن را درک کنیم. Their tongues are ashes when they speak to us. وقتی که با ما حرف میزنند زبانشان خاکستر است. Unable to know is a condition I've lived in all my life. A poverty of imagination about the life of another human being. This is, I think, the case with everyone. It is because there is a silence that we are all of us forbidden to cross. Not only the silence that divides the dead from the living, but antecedent to that is the silence that is between the living and the living. Unable to reach across that silence through the baffling light there always is between us. Among the living, the body can do sometimes, but the mind, constricted, inhibited by its ancestral knowledge of final separation, holds back, unable to complete what it wanted to say. ندانستن حالتی است که تمام عمرم را با آن زیستم. یک تنگ دستی پندار راجع به زندگی یک آدمیزاد دیگر. این فکر می‌کنم سرگذشت همه است. زیرا سکوتی وجود دارد که ما اجازه نداریم آن را پشت سر بگذاریم. نه تنها سکوتی که مرده را از زنده جدا نگه می‌دارد، اما پیشروتر از آن. آیا سکوتی است در میان زنده و زنده؟ سکوتی آلوده در یک نور مغشوش که همیشه بین ماست؟ سکوتی که نمی‌توانیم به سوی دیگر آن دسترسی داشته باشیم؟ بین زندگان جسم گاهی توانایی پیدا می‌کند، اما ذهن منقبض، بازداشته به خاطر آن دانش نیایی که راجع به جدایی نهایی دارد توقف می‌کند و نمی‌تواند آنچه می‌خواست بگوید را کامل کند. What is your name that I can call you by? اسمت چیست که با آن نامت برم؟ Virgil said when Eurydice died again, there was still so much to say that had not been said, even before her first death, from which he had vainly attempted, with his singing, to rescue her. Virgil گفت که یوریدیس دوباره مرد. هنوز خیلی مانده بود که گفته شود که گفته نشده بود. حتی پیش از مرگ اولش که از آن بیهوده کوشید که با سرودن نجاتش دهد.
Wow. Thank you.
Oh.
Yeah.
My pleasure. I'm always so moved by David's poems.
Yeah.
You know, and this is part of our conversations, our weekly conversations.
Yeah.
You know, it's...
Well, there's something about hearing it in the two languages and having it also be about being unable to communicate and trying to communicate.
The tongue of ashes.
Yeah.
And that notion that Eurydice still has more to say, you know.
Yeah.
That there's that gap that's always there.
Yeah, and the silence, the gap between the living and the dead, and antecedent to that, between the living and the living.
Between the living and the living.
Yeah, I love that the point you made about your discussion in class about like what language was God speaking to Adam and Eve in the garden. You know, that languages make you aware of those gulfs. You know?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sassan. This was a wonderful conversation, and we're really looking forward to seeing more of the work. Thanks a lot.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yep, and thank you to our listeners.
Recall This Book was founded by Elizabeth Ferry and me, John Plotz. It is sponsored by Brandeis and the Mandel Humanities Center. Sound editing is by Naomi Cohen, website design and social media by Miranda Puri of the English department. We're eager to hear your comments, criticisms, and thoughts. If you liked what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. From all of us here at RTB, thanks for listening.